All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. It's February 24th, 2018, and we have another very important episode for you today. Many of you have been following the Protect LDS Children case, where Sam Young is leading the charge with 12,000, 13,000 others in a petition to try and get the LDS Church to change its policies around how it talks about sexuality with youth and adults, how it deals with messages around sexuality, how it deals with abuse, etc. And so we've been covering that. And on Friday, we interviewed Sam Young. It was great to have him, Bishop Sam Young, to have him back on Mormon Stories Podcast. Today, we have a special treat. We have Tim Birt. Is that how you pronounce it, Tim?
Yep, Tim Birt. Mm-hmm.
Tim is a licensed professional counselor and a licensed marriage and family therapist. And he is going to be talking to us today about three things. Number one, we're going to briefly cover, sort of from a therapist perspective, in what ways LDS Church policies and teachings around sexuality are both harmful and occasionally helpful. The second thing we're going to be talking about is in what ways the LDS Church's current policies related to child protection and abuse are inadequate or harmful or need improvement. And that's important because recently, in response to Sam Young's efforts, the Church has tried to make the claims that it sort of leads the world in efforts by religions to protect children around abuse. And Tim has his own opinions about this. We're going to be talking about it, since he sort of lives in that world. And then finally, the third thing we're going to talk about is what you, LDS church members, can do to protect your children in your local congregations. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, Tim, if you wouldn't mind, would you mind doing your own sort of formal introduction to our audience, specifically with the intent of letting them know your background and experience as it relates to these very important issues?
Thank you. It's an honor, John, to be here with you on Mormon Stories and with our audience. My name is Timothy Birt. I'm a licensed professional counselor and a licensed marriage and family therapist. Currently, I'm in private practice in Auburn, Alabama and Columbus, Georgia. I have some significant experience in working on child abuse issues. For 14 years, I was the executive director of two different children's advocacy centers. And a children's advocacy center is the current evidence-based best practice in working community response to child sexual abuse and physical abuse. It's a team coordinated response where law enforcement, child protective services, the DA's office, therapists, and medical professionals get together and in a one-stop shop help address allegations of child abuse. When a call comes into a community that has a children's advocacy center, the call goes to either law enforcement or child protective services, and they agree to set up an interview, a forensic interview for children, where a trained forensic interviewer will interview a child in a child-friendly, safe environment, and that child can be found out what is happening with that child in non-leading, professionally trained way that doesn't lead the child and uses the best things we know about interviewing children to be able to find out what happened. And I was executive director of two different of those centers for 13 years. I also have trained about 10,000 mandated reporters on what to look for on child sexual abuse and physical abuse, and worked with systems to help increase their ability to detect and report abuse. I've sat through probably 1,000 interviews on cases of child sexual abuse, mostly in Alabama, not in Utah, and kind of know how the process worked for that. I've also worked with the Boy Scouts of America and other organizations on youth protection policies. And so that's kind of my background a little bit. I'm in private practice right now as a marriage and family therapist and a professional counselor, and I see clients in my office in both locations and work on issues of depression and couples counseling, and work with children who are victims of child abuse and adults who are victims of child abuse and assault and domestic violence. I'm trained in trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, which is one of the evidence-based practices for treating child trauma, and I also work on LGBTQ issues and faith transitions and so forth. I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm active. I am a nuanced person. I have a nuanced set of beliefs, and I actually hold a calling in my local ward as the Boy Scout committee chair.
Excellent. Well, it sounds like you've got a ton of experience that can really help give us perspective, Tim. So thanks for joining us on Mormon Stories today.
Appreciate it.
Also want to give a shout out to Steve Holbrook and Nadine Hansen. Both are board members, OSF board members who have joined us. Doug's on the line. Jarrah Lee's joined us. Kristen's joined us. A lot of cool people. We want to thank all our listeners who are joining us live on Facebook. We want to encourage you to please post your comments and questions on Facebook Live, because it allows these interviews to be a little bit more interactive. So, and also Margie, thanks for joining us all the way from Texas. Okay, so we're going to have 3 parts. So the first part is I asked you to kind of prepare a list of just ways from a therapist perspective that you see the LDS Church's policies and teachings on sexuality as being both beneficial and harmful. So, and so let's begin, and let's talk about the benefits first. We're going to be talking about ways the church can improve, because that's what's most relevant, I think. But why don't we start with just some of the ways that you see the church as being helpful to, children or abuse victims, or even just in its discussions and teachings around sexuality?
Well, first of all, I think that the church does have a strong stance on sexuality in certain ways, and many of us who I'm a convert to the church. I joined when I was a freshman in high school. My wife is a 4th generation Mormon. We both grew up kind of in our formative years, in church with church teachings, and many people in the church do kind of are careful with sexuality, and sometimes that can be helpful to be careful with with who we're sexual with and at what times, and making sure that's the right place and so forth. So I think that to a certain extent that the church teachings may help some members to be kind of insulated from some of the consequences that may have if they didn't have any kind of teachings or values around sexuality. And so that could help. There are people who don't have necessarily, you don't have to be a church member to have values around who you want to have sex with and so forth, certainly, but the church does have that. I think there are values that can be important that the church can teach about, being respectful to other people, about waiting for sexual interaction till maybe later and you're ready. Now they talk about waiting till you're married, and there's certainly people who do that. I mean, we did that, and in ways that some ways was helpful, some ways that was really problematic. So having values, also community. I mean, there are ways that that children and members have a sense of community together, and they have people that have kind of the same way of thinking. They can go to dances and so forth and not necessarily feel pressured to engage in sexual behavior that maybe that they are wanting to wait on, and they can go to BYU or other places where they feel like there are other people of similar values that may want to be careful about use of sexuality, and so I think, and also there's also a connection for commitment, wanting to have commitment in relationships prior to having sexuality, and for them commitment is marriage. And so that in that way, I think commitment can be helpful to do that. So from a therapist standpoint, having values, wanting to seek commitment in relationships, having some ability to think about making those choices and delaying those choices to a certain extent till you feel ready for those, I think is important. And so I think that there are some benefits for that. And the church attempts to try to provide some help for people who feel like they're off track. And I think that in many of the church members' minds, that's one of the purposes for these interviews and so forth. From another perspective, there's lots of problems, I believe, and many of the therapists agree with me, and that there can be lots of problems with the with those interviews and with some of the teachings of way we present sexuality. Isn't more sexuality on thou should not do this. This is a commandment. God wants you to do this, and so forth. That kind of is the direction that the church has on presenting sexuality. So,
Okay, so that's super helpful, and it's good to acknowledge the many ways the church actually can be helpful. And I think I have to agree that there should be people should be thoughtful and intentional about their sexuality. It's not something to be rushed into. They should develop their own values around it. Community support can be super helpful, and emphasizing the importance of committed, loving relationships is all super good. And I think the church can do a really good job at encouraging all that. So that's great. All right, now that we've done that, let's dig into the challenges. So a lot of this we've talked about before in many different ways on Mormon Stories. But Tim, I want to give you your own shot at talking about messages or approaches that the church takes around sexuality, around youth, around abuse, etc., that can be harmful. So why don't you just go ahead and start off with the list?
yeah, well, one of the things I think is very challenging with the church is that it seems to have kind of a shame-based approach. That sexuality is sin, and we hear over and over again how there's a comparison that's made from a verse in the Book of Mormon of that sexual sin is next to murder in importance, and that really can up the ante on what people think about sexuality and so forth. So there's a lot of shame that's put on healthy, natural, normal sexual behaviors. If we start off with things like masturbation, masturbation, has really over the church's lifespan, in the last 50 years or 30 years, has been something of a big focus. And you still have some teachings on lgs.org that that say that masturbation is a sin, although in the new handbook of instructions it is not mentioned. And so there are some stakes and wards and so forth who are not really looking at masturbation in that same way, but it is not uniform across the church. And so masturbation is one of those things that almost every teenager does, and many adults still do. It's one place where we see lots of shame come down on members of the church around those things. It's a normal, natural focus that we do, and many people do. It's part of growing up, and sometimes into adulthood. It's part of our sexuality and stuff, part of committed relationships as well. And it's a way that we learn about our body. It's a way that we prepare to be able to explain to a spouse how our reaction works, and we understand how our arousal works. And so one of the things that we see is shame over sexuality, some normal sexuality behaviors. I mean, I worked in the Children's Advocacy Center, and I can't tell you, and studied a lot about child sexuality. And I have a doctor friend who was giving me a really funny story that they were trying to figure out something with a kid that they thought that had autism or something like that in there are seizures in class, and they found out no, she was just rocking back and forth. And the earliest case of masturbation has been seen actually in vitro on CT on a scan to see a child pleasuring themselves before they're even born. So it's a very natural thing that happens. So part of the thing that also happens is secrecy. I think that sometimes that when things are so shameful and so scary and not really talked about in the LDS Church, we don't talk about sexuality a lot. We use a lot of code words, and we talk about purity, and we talk about being clean. We talk about being virtuous and being modest and so forth. And we use a lot of code words about sexuality and not really talking in depth about what we really mean. In the old days, they talked about petting, and I can't remember how many people in their stories have talked about, well, nowadays, what is petting? We don't even know what that means. So a lot of times what happens is secrecy comes up, that people become secretive about their behaviors, and, oh, I've got to go talk to the bishop about it. And you also see times when members of the church just don't want to do that, or they think that it's different, and then they start not being honest with themselves, or not being honest, feel like they have to be honest with their bishop, and it doesn't make sense to do that, and so they start the sense of secrecy. It also can be a sense of obsession too, when something is forbidden, and we make a link between forbiddenness and sexuality and sensuality, that can have real problems. Not for every member of the church, but for some of them. Some people really make that link, almost Pavlov with his dogs, with, putting the meat powder in front of them and then ring the bell. And then when they, took the meat powder away, you ring the bell and they still have that same response. Some people in the church develop, kind of a responsiveness to the forbidden, that sexuality is forbidden. And so now when it's allowed, there may be not that charge anymore. So those are the beginning ways that we talk about things.
Let me jump in on those. And just around shame, I just want to add, one of the negative consequences of shame, as it occurs to me, is that it always frames sexuality in a negative light.
Yeah.
And instead of the sex positive messages, it's just for 10 or 15 years, anytime you hear anyone talk about sexuality, it's framed negatively. Can you talk just really quickly about how that might not be useful later on?
It isn't useful. I mean, sexuality and intimacy is a very fundamental, beautiful part of life. And it's part of human relations that we want to seek for. And so when we have this idea that there's shame around it, we have to hide it, we can't talk about it, our bodies we have to be modest, we have to cover up our bodies. And if we don't have our bodies covered up, then, a boy might look at us wrong and they might get bad ideas. There's so many intense feelings that can be put us in there. We don't teach consent. We don't teach responsibility. We don't teach respect. We teach this is bad. And so shame becomes attached to sexuality. And then when we talk in a minute or two about people who actually are victims of sexual assault or abuse, and we match that with those kind of feelings, and now we think that, okay, you're responsible for all of this. Or even children or adult teenagers that have normal sexual exploration. They're trying to figure out what their body works, how it works, and how other people works, and so forth. That shame comes in there. I'd like to just give you a little statistic that 83% of children under 13 will engage in some kind of sexual behavior. So we're talking about lots of
83% of children
under the age of 13.
Under the age of 13
will engage in some kind of sexual behavior, whether it's masturbation or whether that's, I'll show you mine if you'll show me yours. I'm not talking about abusive kind of thing, but they will engage as part of the developmental process in understanding something about sexuality is something we learn. It's part of what we learn in growing up. And so if we can't talk about it, we just say it's sinful, it's bad, don't do it. If the whole messages are around that, we don't get a sex positive idea that this is something beautiful. It's something it's a possession, not an obsession. It's something that we work through to be able to understand and value. It's something that draws us together. It's not something to be ashamed of. It's something that's powerful, though. It's like electricity. I mean, you put electricity is very useful, but if you put your hand in the light socket, or you grab onto a high wire line, it can really shock you. So there's ways that sexuality can be used, really detrimentally, and it can really hurt. But it's a powerful tool. But it's not shameful.
And the only other thing I want to say about secrecy is that in something that Sam is saying over and over again, and that we've said for years on Mormon Stories, is that so much shame leads to secrecy. And what secrecy leads to is lying. Right. And so you just have so many people who just learn to lie from a very young age because they don't want to be shamed for not being able to take the sacrament or not being able to pass the sacrament if they're a boy, or not be able to go on a mission, or not being kept out of the temple, because that's such a public shaming. And so in this weird way, the church is sometimes teaching people just to lie. And you just don't want your source of morality to be the one that's actually reinforcing dishonest behavior, where you kind of split. There's the private self that lies, and the private side that does whatever it does, and the public side that lies. I just think that leads to really significant mental health concerns and safety concerns later.
It does. And one of the things that we want to teach children is to have the ability to have consent, that they're in charge of their bodies. They're in charge of situations where they feel uncomfortable. And so what it tells us there, if we have to be secret about things, sometimes children and teens and so forth are secret because they're trying to protect themselves. They realize this is not healthy. And so how do I protect themselves? It's almost like PTSD, an adaptive protective mechanism in the face of something that just is overwhelming or not right. we do these adaptive response. So sometimes the secrecy is actually adaptive and helpful at the time, because it's not, they're being asked questions and they're being taught things that just are harmful. And so they're being secretive about it, but then it develops secrecy as part of intimacy. And that's not okay, later on in relationships. We want to be open and be able to communicate. Matter of fact, healthy sexuality is all about communication and being able to understand one person's needs and other people's needs, being able to talk about what our needs are and be able to be unfiltered.
Yeah. So healthy sexuality as an adult really depends on not having a shame and a secrecy-based foundation to your sexuality.
Right.
All right. What else?
Okay. So we also see that we're unprepared and uninformed for healthy sexuality when it happens. I can't tell you how, if you read Sam's stories and other people's stories, almost every LDS client I've had has in some way been impacted by teachings around sexuality. Even ones that say, I did great. I love my childhood. We stayed away from sexuality before we were married, and we did all the things right. And then what happens is when we have to flip the switch, and now it's okay to be sexual, sometimes we're completely unprepared for that change, unprepared to understand how our bodies respond, understand what the normal response of another person is. Many people don't even understand their physiology, what their body structures are. Women, don't know that their clitoris really is there, and that's part of the place that you really get pleasure. Many women don't know that only like 20 or 30% of women have orgasms in penile-vaginal intercourse, and they think when they get married, well, why didn't it work for me? We're unprepared to be able to understand many of these things because we've been taught not to explore our bodies. We're taught not to talk about it, that it's sinful. And so there's naivete, there's unpreparedness, there's unperformedness, and also there's inadequacy in being able to protect ourselves when we don't learn consent, when we don't learn to be able to say, okay, this question feels weird to my bishop, or this feels weird, I'm not sure I want to answer that, or you got to go hug your Aunt Molly, and hug your Aunt Molly, and we don't teach children that they can say no. When we don't model that in our faith community, we don't model it when someone is a perpetrator starts to groom them. I can't tell you from, being a Children's Advocacy Center director and listened to 1,000 stories, almost every one of those stories, if you went back, somebody had some idea, there's something weird here. Now they may not have known it to report abuse, but almost in every case, there was somebody who got an inkling that something was going on. And the children didn't, and frequently are not believed. We can talk about the process of child abuse and what those things are about, that we need to learn about those things, that bishops and everybody and parents need to know, but we're not prepared, and we're vulnerable. I think we're vulnerable to being groomed. We're vulnerable for entering relationships. We're also, we're so intense about being in love and waiting for sex. I can't tell you how many people will, okay, I'm going to get married. I've got to get married because I want to be sexual. Or I finally want somebody to love me. And they haven't had enough relationships to learn out how to pick somebody right, how to go through and learn about relationships and communication.
Really quickly, this is just a side note. Your microphone on your headset is hitting the little collar of your shirt.
Oh, my
so
bad.
If you could just make sure it doesn't lean forward or whatever, so it doesn't scrape against that. Sorry about that.
Thank you.
Okay. So this is great. Going back to uninformed and unprepared, you say words like vagina and clitoris and penis. Mormons have a hard time just hearing and saying those words alone or with family members, let alone in a church context. And so, one might ask, well, what role could a church possibly have in keeping someone informed and prepared about sexuality? Dare anyone ever say the word clitoris or penis or vagina in the chapel? My guess is that most members of the church have gone their whole lives and literally never heard those words uttered in a church setting. Now, having said that, there are churches that actually do a really good job of sex education. Are you aware of the Unitarian Universalist sex education program?
I've heard about it. I don't know a lot about it, but I know that there are churches and different organizations that do a much better job.
Okay.
They talk about consent and so forth. Yeah.
So I'm going to go ahead and just plug it. So the Unitarian Universalist Church has a sex education program called Our Whole Lives, or OWL, OWL. It's lifespan sexuality education. And a Mormon might, be suspicious and say, "Oh my gosh, they must want their kids to be sexually promiscuous and sexually deviant because they're teaching their kids about sexuality." But the truth is, and this is something Natasha's told us, and you could tell us as well, isn't it true that proper healthy education leads to more responsible decisions on sexuality, not less?
It does. It does. Yeah. The statistics on that is when we have good sex education, the kids are less sexual. They make better choices. And when you have abstinence only or known, it's not good. Now, parents do need to be involved in this. Parents need to start talking about sexuality and asking questions and answering questions from the time they're little. So there isn't the birds and the bees conversation. You're having the conversations all along. Like my child, when he was going into a new kindergarten class, was asked the question, mid-semester when he just moved in, "Where did you come from?" And my son looks, he thought, he says, "I came from my mother's uterus." So he already knew these kind of things. So we need to be able to answer questions. And part of the way to do that, we'll talk about later, is that we need to ask our children questions and ask them what they think about things. And find out what they know and answer questions all along. So we need to have that. We need to have bystander training in our congregations. We need to be able to teach consent. The church materials talk a lot about what not to do, but they don't talk about how to be responsible in our relationships. And that's a real missing piece.
Yeah, absolutely. And so just to kind of, you went through this list sort of point by point. I just want to make sure we cover each one. So you talk about naivete, and I think that's totally true because we don't have good educations and good discussions and good comfort with sexuality. We go into sex really naive. And the example that often gets used are these college girls who want to remain virgins, and so they have anal sex instead of vaginal sex without any idea, number one, that that's sex, but number two, that there are all sorts of health concerns with that sort of approach, right?
Right.
Or with
Yes.
people not knowing what actually leads to impregnation or not. In what ways sexually transmitted, diseases or infections can be transmitted without penile vaginal intercourse, etc. Talk about obsessions really quick, and how obsessions around sexuality can be really damaging. Obsessions around modesty, obsessions around sin, sexual repression. I just have to say, I saw a fascinating musical the other day called The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And I had never seen the musical before, but there's this priest who is just obsessed, a Catholic priest in the musical, who's obsessed about everyone's sexuality. And he becomes so obsessed about everyone's sexuality and even about never having his own sexual thoughts that he becomes sexually deviant as a result of the obsession. Is that a fair connection to make in your experience?
It is. I mean, there's a quote that says that sexuality has become transferred from a possession to an obsession through its repression. And I think that sometimes we become obsessed around it when we can't think of these things. We don't think about those things. I mean, there's a reason why we think that, why Utah thinks it has a pornography problem. Now, I'm not bought into the whole, that pornography is the new drug or things like that. Pornography is a sense of disconnectedness in relationships. If it's causing a problem in your relationship, you can't talk, you can't ask for what you need, you can't, enjoy erotica together. So the reality is we can become very obsessed about sexuality, and we can, like I said, we can link the idea of it being forbidden Okay. And so now sexuality becomes forbidden. Now when it's allowed, well, there isn't a charge there anymore. Well, what do I do that's forbidden? And so there is a link with that. Also, the obsessions with modesty. We have to be so modest around these things. I mean, we can't wear a two-piece bathing suit because what? Because the boys might look at us wrong? Well, because we're worried that men or young men can't control their sexual feelings, and they can't, they'll obsess or something, and they'll think about us. Well, there's big problems with that. We need to be able to say they're responsible for their stuff, and what I wear doesn't matter. It's almost like saying, well, you're partially responsible for your rape because you were wearing, provocative clothing, and everyone else is responsible for their behavior. So we become obsessed about, we think that necessarily being modest is somehow virtuous, that we're somehow better, that's going to protect us. What happens sometimes with these obsessions, we think that we're obsessed with being clean and pure. And then we have so many of these people get married, and they think that they've obeyed all the commandments, they were chaste, they were modest, they were all this, and now they're married and they're supposed to work fine, and it doesn't work. It's really hard. And they're saying, well, God, you let me down. I did all the things I was supposed to do, and now it doesn't work. And then later, when they learn all the things that they needed to know to be able to have a relationship and about their bodies and about sexuality, they sometimes feel cheated. That's sad. The church, that's a sad way that people that are the most faithful then later on feel like, that the church or God let them down.
I love it. When you talk about inadequacies, one thing that comes to mind is just the importance of the connection between emotional intimacy and sexual intimacy. People just think that you get married and then you just have fantastic sex all the time because two bodies are rubbing up against each other. And what many find out is that initial excitement wears off, and that to develop a healthy, mature sexual intimacy in a marriage or in a committed relationship requires really strong connected emotional intimacy, not avoidance and not suppression and that sort of thing. But we don't ever learn about what emotional intimacy is. And in some ways, the church can even disconnect us from ourselves and from others in terms of emotional intimacy, which then makes it really hard to have a healthy sex life. Any comments on that?
Absolutely. Communication is the key there. I mean, one of the things that therapists will do working on sexual issues is a thing called sensate focus, which we have each partner learn, starting out with very non-sexual things, maybe holding hands or giving, touching or back rubs and so forth, and learning to one person giving and the other person receiving. One person being able to say, hey, this was what feels good for me. And this person being able to find out what works for the other person and get basically a benefit and really feel connected by giving to their one's partner and be able to communicate. Then we work on that to become more and more involved in different types of more intimacy things. But that's the key to feeling connected. When we feel understood and accepted and listened to, we feel connection, we feel intimacy. And so part of it is communication and being able to talk about it. When we can't even say the words, when we've never talked about it, when we just have these assumptions, when people have 3 ways to have sex and that's the only way they do it, and then it wears off, we start to have problems.
I love it. I've got a question that sometimes people probably don't think about. How does patriarchy hurt sexual intimacy? And I've got some thoughts, but I'll ask you first.
Well, part of it in patriarchy is that the man is in charge, okay? And it's their needs get filled. And so frequently, you hear about the man thinking, okay, sexuality is about me and I'm going to get my needs met, and now you're my wife. And so now, that's what I need. And so you'll obey the leader of the home. And so it focuses the connections and the needs on his needs, and the other person is supposed to be the follower. Okay, well, we're supposed to listen and obey the priesthood holder. And so obviously if he needs sex, well, okay, that's what we need to do. And so the man's pleasure, the man's priorities, the man's things is preference to the woman. It's not necessarily equal. And he may not think about, well, is my partner being, fulfilled? What's my partner's needs? And we do have some men in the church who will, think, well, it's, I need sex, and so this is part of it, and so please give it to me, and so they may not understand that women need to feel cared for. They're relational, and in order for women to feel really connected and sexual and intimate, they want to be well treated. They want to be considered, they want to be important. And so that's what gets them, more ready for, kind of sexual contact and to intimacy. And that's what more intimacy is about. But for men, stereotypically, it's around the other way. You can see this clearly in what's men's porn versus women's porn. Men's porn is pictures. Women's porn is romance novels, and
like Highlander, right? Is that what it's called?
I'm not familiar with all the different romance novels, but the idea in that is that, sometimes he perceives my needs before I even said them, and that's not what men in patriarchy are taught to do. That we're not try to find out what our communicate what our spouse's needs are. And so patriarchy can very much feel like it's a focus of the needs of the man and kind of the repression of the needs of the woman. The woman has to be more submissive, has to be backseat. They have to be the follower. And so that can go into domestic violence as well. And unrighteous dominion and all of and these type of things. Just the preferencing we give upon for men as and women as not being equal. And it also plays out in a minute when we talk about bishops' interviews and so forth. It's not the Young Women's president or the Relief Society president that women go talk to. They have to go talk to a man. And that's a whole different experience.
Talk about the church's teachings on chastity. We've talked about the licked cupcake and the object lessons, but talk about how the church's approach to chastity can be really harmful.
Chastity, I mean, the idea that there is this thing called virginity, and we don't even say that word in Mormonism usually. We say pure, we want to be clean, we want to be chaste, and there's so much energy built up upon these ideas that weren't very well defined. We don't know what they mean by it. And the church leaders will use these vague terms because they don't want to define them very well. And when people misunderstand kind of what they're meaning, and there's this whole idea that chastity is virtue, and you can lose your virtue somehow, that you can lose. And so part of the problem is how we language it, and also how people experience the idea of this, that this is something that you can lose, that something that your virtue is necessarily tied to it.
And that's not good because it's not true.
Not true. No, not true at all. Part of the idea is that you don't lose your virtue by some sexual act that either happened to you or you did. Your virtue, if there is a thing called virtue, it's character. I mean, what are you making on your choices? How respectful are you to other people? How, are you acting out of selfishness? Are you not out of, that's what more, in my mind, virtue is. Now, when we get into sexual abuse and so forth, it will be really apparent how problematic this is. Given that many, many children will engage in some kind of sexual behavior, even though they're not abused. When you get into the abuse part of things, when 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 girls are sexually abused before their 18th birthdays, and 1 in 5 to 1 in 8 boys, it really, really can be damaging when a person, that has already experienced non-consensual sexual contact, gets the lick cupcake piece that says, okay, now you're damaged goods. And we don't even talk about repentance in that or anything like that. We make children think that they have to repent of things that happen to them, where they're victims. And we'll talk a little bit more about victimology and how problematic that is.
Let's go ahead and talk about ways that the church doesn't handle sexual abuse victims and sexual assault victims properly. And this will be separate from your recommendations, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, so part of the problem is that we don't give any training to bishops to really understand sexual abuse. Now, there are some exceptions. There's some really good bishops and stake presidents and so forth who have done that on their own. And part of the issue is that, like, if a person comes in and says, they're asked about chastity, or they're asked about something, and they say, well, I let him touch me. Okay. And let's say that's a teenager and so forth. The bishop isn't, first of all, is talking about these things untrained. They may ask, okay, well, you let him touch me. Well, that, they're thinking that's a sin. They don't have no idea to understand that he let him touch me, that this person is way older, that it was an abusive situation. And children don't even really know how to define very well what is happening to them. And so this could very much be an abusive situation. When we look at differentials in teen pregnancy, and we look at who the father was, I mean, in a great percentage of that, like over 40% of the time, there's an age gap between the pregnant mother and the father. And sometimes those age gaps are criminal, and so just telling the girls, okay, just don't, just say no and don't so forth. These kind of situations are actually rape. They're statutory rape or they're rape. When we have sexual reactive children, there's all kinds of sexual behavior issues in children. There's the normal sexual behavior like masturbation. Let me show you mine. Let me see yours. Let me figure out, there I have external, internal plumbing, how this kind of works, touch, see what that feels like. Then you have the next step up is sexual reactive behavior. Sexual reactive behavior is when something's been turned on sexually in that child. They may have been touched, they may have been exposed to sexual materials that are out of their age range. And frequently children will try to act out what they see to make sense of it. So a child who's been touched sexually may touch another child, or may touch themselves in ways that, in inappropriate situations, and it may come to the noise. Or they may be in situations where they say, hey, he touched me. So the sexually reactive behavior is acting out that. Then we have other kinds of sexual behavior problems in children, ones that, a very small number of children actually have, are perpetrating kind of sexuality on other children. But for the most part, what happens is that there is this sense of that the church leaders don't understand abuse or assault. In assault, when you're being sexually assaulted, you may, you're in flight, freeze. And what people don't understand that, but in freeze, when you're overwhelmed and you can't run away and you can't do anything about it, there are times when you actually can't speak. You actually can't fight. You actually can't do anything. And so when Kimball said, it's better that you had died if you should fight. It's better to have died than to lose your virtue. It's such a problematic message. Such a problematic message, given what we know about how trauma works in children. Many of these children don't know the difference of what's happening to them. They don't know that this is not normal behavior. Many of them are, if they do know later on, they're threatened. You tell, I'm going to kill your dog, or you're going to be in trouble. Most children, have a connection and a relationship with the abuser. And so they may be willing to endure this kind of abuse because they may be getting the most, that abuser may be giving them the most connection of anybody else in their life. And so part of the teachings of the church doesn't understand this. We don't understand when we're teaching a young women's lesson that 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 of those girls may be sexually abused already. If you ask any adult woman, if you ask them the right questions, whether they've ever been sexually assaulted or they've had, sexually harassment done, almost, when you explain what that is, almost everyone will say they have. So our church teachings aren't prepared for that. We look at the new missionary guidelines on missionary interviews. It has all these intense questions they wanted to ask. There's nothing in there to say, be aware that they might have been sexually abused. They're not asking, have you ever been touched or allowed someone to touch you? There's no proviso in there to say, hey, they might be victim of sexual abuse or sexual assault. And that's not something they need to talk to you about. Matter of fact, they need to probably refer to a therapist.
Right. So, what is child abuse accommodation syndrome?
Okay. Child abuse accommodation syndrome is a paper that was written by Roland Summit back in the 80s. It's about the same type of paper as the battered child paper that came out earlier that really brought out what physical abuse was for children. Basically, the child abuse accommodation syndrome paper is a paper that every professional should read. You know, we've learned more since then, but what it says is basically a child, when they're subject to abuse, especially in a familial or connective way with the person they know, will keep it a secret. They will not talk about it. Even ones that are really young, they somehow know not to talk about it. Then it says they accommodate. They will accommodate to the abuse, meaning they will learn to live with it. They will learn to interact with those people. They will not make it out. When there is disclosure, they will feel bad about it too. They will feel shame. Um, every child abuse victim that I worked with, or that my therapist worked with when I was in advocacy center, we asked them if they felt responsible and shame. Even the ones who knew it wasn't their fault, they felt shame. So they're going to feel shameful about it. So what happens is they don't tell about it. If they do tell, frequently it's delayed, meaning that most outcries of child abuse are not happening right when it's happening. If it's a stranger in a park that comes up to them, they don't know, and it's just completely out of the moment, they might tell right away. But most interfamilial or connective ones, they don't. So what happens is it starts with a grooming process. They're groomed to be able to make sure that they're not going to tell. And then over time, the sexuality becomes more and more intensive. So when there is a disclosure, it's usually delayed and unconvincing. They'll start by saying, well, he bothers me. I don't like him. And the child will think they've told their parent or some other caregiver or a church leader that they've been abused. They won't realize that they didn't get that. And what the child will also do is wait to see what the response is from the caregiver, from the church leader, from the teacher. And if the teacher is, oh my, I don't believe that, then they won't tell them anymore. So they'll start with something really little and they'll see the response, and then they'll go further to find out what happens. So when we'd interview children, we'd realize the first thing that if they're going to tell about us, they're going to tell us about something small. And then later on, they may tell more and more and more and more. Also, children don't speak adult, and adults don't speak children. We don't know this until we go to court and we listen to court testimonies and so forth. You can ask, that's why we need a trained forensic interviewer to interview children to find out what's happening. Bishops and parents and so forth don't know how to do this, don't know how to interpret children's response. If you asked a child and yes or, has anything ever happened to you like this? The answer is usually going to be no, because children don't answer that question yes. So the next thing is it's delayed and unconvincing disclosure. The next part of it is if there are consequences in the child's life. If it's like, well, daddy's going to get arrested, or that mom didn't believe me, or that, those things that the perpetrator told me that no one believe you and you'll get in trouble start happening, many children will recant. They will say, oh no, it didn't happen, I was lying, and so forth. Now, frequently this happens more in teenage years, especially when teenagers are starting to, well, I'm not willing to keep daddy's secret anymore because, he's not letting me date people, and he's not doing this. So the teenager may be in trouble already. And so now when they say these, they're not believed. And when bad things start to happen, they realize that there's a flip, that they're responsible for keeping the family together. And they have to lie to do that. So the right thing to do becomes saying it didn't happen, so the family can stay together or things can go back to normal. The wrong things to do is to tell the truth and to say it did happen. So that's the accommodation syndrome. And what it also says is that we as society we're really relieved when we realize, the child was just making it up, or that was a misunderstanding. We're like, wow, good. We're feel good about that. So the whole system can respond, to support the child's denial. Now, in the Children's Advocacy Center, what we would do, let me finish one second. What we would do is when we'd interview these children, sometimes we wouldn't have enough information to know if there was an allegation of abuse. And so, but we suspected something. And then we would do what we call a forensic evaluation. And that was a extended forensic interview. In about 70% of those cases where we couldn't find out what happened the first time, we would figure out that when the child was in a safe environment, they would reaffirm. So that's the accommodation syndrome, and we need to understand that children aren't good at disclosure. And that when they sound unconvincing and they change their story or things like that, children don't tell a story in a straight way that it sounds like, there's nothing to it.
I've heard several victims of abuse say that the bishop sometimes found a way to blame them for being complicit. Can you talk about what would make a bishop possibly want to blame a victim for the abuse that occurred?
Well, they would ask, well, did you ask for it? I mean, what the situation was.
Where were you? Did you allow
where were
yourself
you?
to be alone? Right? Were you
Right,
drinking? Right?
right. Or, whether their body responded, where
Did
you
you
were
enjoy
drinking.
it? Did you
Did you
enjoy it?
enjoy it? Yeah. Did you
Right?
enjoy it? Right. Absolutely. And so part of the problem is they don't understand that there's a power differential between even the teenager and the abuser. And so all of these things, one of the things we learn is that children's bodies respond when they're touched in a certain way. It just means it works. It doesn't mean that they enjoyed it. It doesn't mean that they want it. It doesn't mean they like it. The other thing we need to understand
It's almost
is
as if enjoying it is bad too.
right. Well, that's what they say. Well, actually, in
Like
treating
sexual enjoyment is bad somehow. Yeah.
well, right. Yeah, sexual employment isn't bad. It's good, but it can be really complicated for victims, because when they have the complicated process and working through this in therapy, when they say, "Hey, this felt good and it didn't feel wrong, and I needed connection, and this person was actually the nicest person in the world to me, and I needed somebody to care about me, and so yeah, I didn't know, and I went in, and they felt part of it. They felt, even though they knew, almost all of them know that they weren't responsible, almost all of them feel shame. So in treatment, that's really tough, because all of us want to say it's not your fault. That's the first thing we want to say. But as a therapist, we have to be really careful with that, because as soon as we've told them it's not their fault, we've told them we can't hear you. We can't hear your story. We can't hear your perspective. And no, now it's not their fault, but they have to come to that realization. And so the bishop, there's no way the bishop that's untrained can do this. And if you have a trained bishop, like I know somebody who's a very trained person, who's a church leader, it's not appropriate for them to be doing that kind of counseling with their people. That is a dual relationship.
Right. Yeah. And so it's important for them to refer to
Yeah.
a professional.
Right. And a professional, not just LDS Family Services.
Now aren't LDS Family Services professionals?
I live in Alabama. I don't even know how to get a hold of the LDS Family Services or somebody who would come to work at LDS Family Services here. So I'm not qualified to talk about that. But my understanding is, you need to refer to a therapist for a child or a teenager who's trained in an evidence-based practice to deal with child trauma, like child-focused cognitive behavioral therapy or one of the other evidence-based practice, who's an expert in doing it, not just a normal therapist. That's what would be my recommendation. And so, I don't know, there may be LDS Family Services therapists that are trained and are able to deal with sexual abuse. If there are, fine. If there aren't, there need to refer to competent people.
Got it. What is it that makes it instinctual for many of us, and especially bishops, to not believe victims when they report? Why wouldn't we just always believe a victim when they report something? Can you just tell what it is in our psychology, or what it is with the bishop that might make a bishop not believe a victim?
Well, some of this stuff is so far out of what we normally think of as happening, because child abuse and domestic violence is not something that victims talk about a lot. It's kind of like the World War II victim that came back, or not victim, but soldier who came back, who didn't talk a lot about their things. It's not something that's talked about in society. We don't talk about abuse. We don't talk about that. So it's not something that normal people hear a lot about. Normal members of the church don't understand that 1 in 4 girls are sexually abused before their 18th birthday. They don't know that this is so common. It's an epidemic. And so when they hear something that's completely out of their, experience base, it's like, well, how could that be happening? Then also they know brother, Jones or brother Smith or whatever. He's a good guy. He shows up for church. He pays his tithing. He loves his children. We see that. She's a great mom. There's no way she could be hitting her children. Anyway, there isn't a correlation between, and I can say this as a director of Children's Advocacy Center, between, the way they look and whether they were responsible for abuse.
Or how nice they appear,
Or
right?
how nice they appear. No, not at all. Not at all. And so the reality is that we don't want to believe this. And also when children come out and they talk about it, like I said, the first disclosures are tentative. They're testing the water on how you're going to accept it. So they may make unconvincing, kind of things. I don't like, he was mean to me. He kind of messed with me, well, what do you mean by messed with? They don't know how to ask the right questions. And also children don't tell their story, the beginning, the middle, the end. They tell a little bit here and a little bit there, a little bit there. They're not trained to do that. And so when we see inconsistencies with, what they're saying, we go, oh no, that can't be the case. Also, it's just really scary. I mean, how can I confront this parent? How can I call this in? What's it going to do to their family? I got to make sure that this is right before I call it in. So they become investigators of their own. And as soon as they find it, there's nothing here. They don't understand that their requirement is to report suspected abuse. They shouldn't be involved. And I can't tell you how many cases involving, I'm not going to go into any details, but, how many cases involving organizations and churches and leaders and, of churches and so forth that, messed up investigations because they, do their own investigation, or they, don't report. And some of those cases actually, when they go to trial, are harder because the mandated reporter didn't do their job.
So talk about what is mandated reporting and how does and does it not play out well within Mormonism?
Okay. So my understanding is that every state, all the 50 states, require mandated reporting of abuse. Now, most states, I believe, involve clergy in that. You'd have to check on each one of your states. Now, clergy is the most complicated mandated reporter there is. Okay. So a normal mandated reporter, like a teacher or a doctor or a therapist, anytime you suspect abuse, child abuse, no matter how you hear about it, you have to report it. And what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to report it directly and personally, not refer it to someone else. You're supposed to call Child Protective Services in the place where the child lives and law enforcement in the place where this may have occurred. If you don't know, just call Child Protective Services. Just call law enforcement. They'll sort it out. Okay. So with normal mandated reporters, you have to report everything you hear and suspect. The issue around clergy is a little different because there's this thing called, the priest penitent privilege. And it's a really important thing. Almost all advocacy groups for victims recognize this. If your eternal salvation, if you believe, is based on you being square with God, and you go in a confidential basis and you're worried about your eternal salvation, and you talk to your priest, your bishop, your stake president, or your pastor, and you expect confidentiality, that communication is privileged. Now, bishops and stake presidents and branch presidents violate this all the time. They call up other people, they tell everybody what's happening there, and they can actually get sued for doing that. So the thing that a bishop or stake president learns from a person in a confessional, that person saying, hey, I did this, they can't report that. But the issue is if they hear it from the child, if the spouse comes in saying, there's something funky going on with my husband, there's something funky going on with my cousin, if they hear about it from another ward member, if they see it themselves, if they hear about it because an employee, okay, well, the primary teacher said that, so-and-so, beat the child. They hear it from any other place, they have to report it.
Okay. So let's say if the abusive husband confesses it, then confidentiality is on. But if the wife or the child or another person in the ward or community reports it, then mandated reporting is on. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. He reports everything he heard in that other conversation and nothing he heard in the privileged conversation.
What if the child says, I was abused, but you can't tell anyone?
No, you have to report it.
A bishop does?
Yep.
Why?
Because it's a mandated reporting. They're a child.
A child reporting it is not protected.
Okay. A child, no, you mean a child said that they abused somebody else?
No, a child says that they were
I was
abused.
abused. Yeah, no, that's mandated reporting. You have to, and part of the thing is we don't do informed consent on these bishops' interviews. We don't. The bishop doesn't come in and say, "Hey, everything you talk about, if you tell me this, I have to report it." When you or I do therapy with someone, we have informed consent. We tell them exactly what the requirements are. We don't have training for members of the church that says, what the reporting requirements are. They don't know. So if a child comes in and says they're being abused, it has to be reported.
And oftentimes bishops don't report
They don't report. Now, the exception of
when they
that,
should.
the only exception to that is not when a child. When someone was 42 who comes in and says, you know what, I remember my father molesting me. Now, mandated reporter is a mandated reporter of child abuse. A child is someone who's under 18. So basically, someone who's 42 and says my 85-year-old grandfather abused me when I was 6, that is not mandated reporting. They don't have to report that. But they can encourage the victim to report it, because then when the child turns 18, they get consent to be able to say how they want their abuse case handled. So that's one of the other provisos in there. Now, most victim advocacy groups are okay with this. Now, a lot of people say, well, I want everything reported. The problem is that we have to have some sanctity in the idea that you can talk to your bishop about things and it stays between you and God and them. But later on, we'll talk about whether these sexual victim, bishop interviews are a good idea or not.
Okay. And talk really quickly about the church's helpline and why it's maybe not adequate.
Okay. Well, I've never called the church's helpline, and I haven't called it recently. So I don't have any firsthand experience with it. It's a helpline that's not available for therapists. It's available for bishops. And
it's not available for victims, right?
Not that I know of.
Yeah.
It's not generally posted. It's in, the handbook that's not circulated and so forth. And the directions that I've heard about it is, if you don't know what to do, call the helpline. Now, the problem is we haven't trained bishops to know their reporting requirements, and it's different in different states and it's different in different areas. But they haven't done state by state training. Now, most congregations and organizations like the Boy Scouts, every council has a plan on what they're doing in their council. They know who to call, and so the church hasn't done that. So they call the helpline, and the helpline's supposed to be answered by professional counselors and by lawyers. And so, there are stake leaders who've told me they've called the helpline and it was all about the victim. I've also heard many stories about that it was more about protecting the liability of the church. It's what the helpline is, to help the church to figure out what to do about this situation. There's a portion of that's okay, because the bishop may not know what to do if they come up with information. But the problem is that there is a concern that it's protect the legality of the church foremost, rather than the victim. Now, that's not what the church has just said in their most recent release. And so I'd love to back them up on that, and I'd love them to have that to be their priority. But they may need to do some changes to make it show that it is apparent.
My understanding that the people on the other end of that line are Kurt and McConkie lawyers. I don't know if that's true, but that's my understanding.
I don't know, but it does say in the new church newsroom release about how the church approaches abuse, that that helpline, it has professional counselors and lawyers, and so that's what it says. But I think the church needs to do much more, and we'll talk about this a little more in a minute, to make it apparent that there's a process to report abuse, and that reporting is for the victim and not to protect the legal interest of the church or the bishop.
Right. Really quickly, fundamental to the teachings of Jesus Christ is this idea of forgiveness, repentance and forgiveness. Mm-hmm. Talk about when that can be harmful to victims of abuse, the encouragement of forgiveness.
Mm-hmm. I never talk about forgiveness at all with any of the victims that I work with. If they bring it up, it's down the line. And the idea of forgiveness is so much coordinated in with the idea of being able to make it okay and make that person feel better and so forth. The problem is that the victim has to have boundaries. Okay. Forgiveness doesn't mean that it's okay to do this again. It doesn't mean that we're able to feel comfortable to be around them again and so forth. So the forgiveness is a really complicated thing, and forgiveness is not a subject that, even I, as a therapist working with people who've been victims of sexual abuse and sexual assault, I don't go there unless they bring it up, and then we talk a lot about it. Now, so it's very inappropriate for, if a professional counselor doesn't do that, it's very inappropriate for a clergy member to ever talk about, that the victim needs to forgive somebody. And many times they will. They will talk about the repentance process that somehow is supposed to help. Even in the church's new resources, it talks about the repentance process is there and the atonement is there. Well, that can very quickly become a message that, there is something to repent of when you're a victim, and that you need to forgive. And that's part of what's important. I just think it's very problematic.
Another thing I want to note, and I learned this from Elizabeth Smart, is that we ought to be more cognizant within the church of the fact that our messages around sexuality leave even victims of abuse to feel dirty.
Yeah.
I don't know how much, you talked about this before, the lick cupcake, but it's just important to note that, people asked Elizabeth Smart after she was unchained and after she was roaming around town with her abuser and was not running away and breaking free, people asked her why she didn't scream and run away. And what she said was the messages in the church around sexuality and purity and virginity and worthiness made her feel so dirty and unworthy, even though she knew that she was a victim, that she didn't feel like she had the value to speak out and to save herself. Am I getting that right or wrong, or what have you heard?
Absolutely. When former talk by Spencer W. Kimball, the love versus lust, or the miracle of forgiveness, talks about that you need to fight, and if it's better to lose your life than to fight. There's been so many messages over time. Now we're hopefully now not sending those messages anymore. I know in my area they don't give the miracle of forgiveness. They don't do that. But those messages are still there, that somehow you lost your virginity, that you lost this, that that somehow you are tainted, you're broken, you're something wrong with you. If you didn't even if you consent to things, it doesn't change your worth. And there is this whole idea that your worth is somehow equated to your virtue, which is the code word for sexual inexperience and innocence and virginity. And so if you don't have that, then somehow your worth is not there. And it doesn't take too many people off message, or even the old messages, to get there. And so they feel shame. And even kids that aren't in the church, I'm telling you, the kids that I've worked with who knew it wasn't their fault still feel ashamed that this had happened to them, and they felt responsible. And when you feel responsible, you feel like it's partly your fault. And that's hard stuff.
Right. Talk about, what we could do to help our children become educated so that they're less at risk. And the opposite of that, talk to Sam Young's concern about how unintentionally allowing a 12-year-old kid to be alone with a grown man in a room talking about sexuality might actually be unintentionally grooming them, making them vulnerable to be susceptible to the abuse of others later.
Yes. So what we want to try to teach children from a young age is to be able to ask questions about sexuality, about that it's open, we can talk about it, that, even if we're a little bit embarrassed, where it's fine, we can answer questions about that. And we also want to teach children, as soon as they're able to do self-care, as soon as they're able to toilet, as soon as they're able to bathe, as soon as they're able to take care of most of their needs, that their bodies are theirs. And they're responsible for it, and they have the ability to say no. They have consent. Okay, so when I teach parents to do body safety kind of things, we talk about, when they go to the doctor and they have the well child check, and the doctor needs to look at their genitalia, that the doctor needs to ask permission, and the child can say no. Okay, when Aunt Susie comes over and wants a big slobbering hug, and the child doesn't want to, that they can say no, and the parents and the adults will back them up, even when it's socially awkward. That's teaching the child that they have consent, that their body is theirs, and their sense of what's okay and not okay is theirs. Okay, the same thing applies to when they go into a situation where an adult is asking them to do something poorly. This adult comes up and say, "Hey, let me help you find my puppy." And the child says, "No, I'm not going to do that. It's okay." And the parent and the adult says, "Okay, well, no, you need to do this." Like, I'm going to go walk on a door and ask for help here. So part of the idea is we want to teach our children that they're in charge of their bodies, and they're in charge of situations, not only their bodies, but social situations that feel awkward, and they can say no to adults. And adults will back them up and help them. Okay, so when we send a 12-year-old or an 8-year-old, 7-year-old into an interview with a bishop, and the bishop asks a 7-year-old, "Do you masturbate?" Or a 12-year-old, "Do you masturbate?" First of all, that's an inappropriate question. And second of all, the child doesn't feel like they can say no to their church leader. And the church leader is evaluating their worthiness to get baptized, or to move on to young women's, or to go on a temple trip, or to get ordained to the priesthood, or be the Mind Maids president. And so it's hard to be able to say, well, I can't say no to my priesthood leader asking me these questions. So we're not teaching consent. We're not giving the child the ability to say, this doesn't feel okay. Matter of fact, parents are sending them in there. "Oh yeah, you got to go tell the bishop. Yeah, answer their questions." So what we're doing is we're not teaching consent. We're not teaching the child that they have the ability to say things for themselves, and that they know that caring adults in their lives are going to back them up, including it would be good for church leaders to back them up. For a church leader, for a kid to say, "I don't feel comfortable for having this interview alone. Can I have my young women's leader with me?" And it would be perfect for if we're going to do those interviews, it would be right for the bishop to say, "Absolutely, of course, of course you can," and not say, "Well, if you don't look to do this, well, I'm not sure you're worthy. I'm not going to give you, I'm not going to give you this youth temple trip blessing, because you're not willing to abide by my rules." That's abusive. It's training kids that they can't speak for themselves and they can protect themselves.
Love it. And of course, how devastating would it be if the kid is not believed and the abuser is protected, and that comes from a church leader?
Yeah.
How devastating would that be to the kid's future of feeling like they have any power over, in their lives against abuse, right?
Yeah. Well, spiritual abuse and misuse of power is really horrible. Because it disconnects them from their belief system and from what they hold sacred, and they don't trust. They've been taught to believe in God, and God is supposed to be there for them all the time, answer their prayers, and love them, this perfect heavenly parent that's always on their side. And when God's representative is the one that's abusing them, even in ways of asking them inappropriate questions, but even worse if they're getting off on the answers, "Tell me how that felt," how like Bishop, Sam Young would say, "How many fingers," or things like that. It's just awful. Even worse if they are the abuser or are protecting the abuser.
Bishops occasionally are predators.
Yeah. Not very often, but yeah, there's way too many. In the church, in this new thing, says even one case is too many. So we don't have just one case; we got thousands.
Yeah. So children need to learn that their authority, their authority trumps even priesthood authority, and that's
absolutely,
that's probably really hard for the church to ever allow to happen, right?
Right. And the problem is too, let's say the child complains or the adult complains. They complain to the bishop, who's the person who is misusing it, or they complain to the stake president. Well, the stake president is the person who selected that bishop, and the stake president and the bishop are the person they're responsible for their temple recommends. And let's say it goes above them to the general authority. Well, the general authority is the one that's responsible for picking, maybe the stake president, so the problem is the investigative part of this process is also the part of the process that may be going wrong. And it's also tied up in all this power structure over your sense of how worthy you are. If you're going to be able to go back to your Heavenly Father, if you can go to the temple, if you get married, if you can go on a mission, you can complain to them. And there are examples now that we've heard, not in my local area, but in other areas I've heard of, that, the bishop says, well, if you will need these, if you're not agreeing to our process, then your kid can't participate, and maybe we'll take your temple recommend away, if you complain too much. And so it's just really that there isn't a process that people can complain that's outside the ecclesiastical lines of authority.
Yeah. Now, two things that I think the church is often going to say. The first is, we as priesthood leaders can really help counsel kids, educate them, give them a chance to repent. And so, but they're not going to do it if somebody else is in the room. And so we need that one-on-one confidentiality so that they feel like they can trust the disclosure. What's your response to that? And then I have a second follow-up question.
So the first thing is that we want to look at general principles of child protection. Okay. Even the Boy Scouts of America says too deep leadership, no one-on-one contact. So we require that for scouting outings, but we let the bishop be one-on-one. We won't let the bishop count tithing or make a bank deposit, just him and the counselor.
That's a great point. I forgot about that. Yeah.
But we trust the bishop alone with our children. Okay. Untrained, and with all of his, even if they have good policies now, he's raised from the time when it wasn't. So the issue is that, so what we're asking for, and I agree with Sam, is we're asking for the end of one-on-one interviews. I think that, I'm going to give you alternatives to that, which can help the church meet its needs to educate and to be able to provide safety for the children, to provide, training on what they want to do. There's ways to do that without one-on-one things. Now, there are going to be a few circumstances where the kid wants to, let's say that they are being a victim of abuse. Now, the bishop and the church can be an incredible resource to help end that abuse. The child wants to come in and report abuse, and it's the parent, okay? Well, then you don't have the parent in the room, but what we're asking for is another adult of the child's choosing to be in the room. If we have to have these interviews, another adult of the child's choosing. That could be the young women's president. It could be, could be the young men's president. It could be their home teacher. It could be someone else. It could be the other counselor on the bishopric. Now, let's say the child doesn't want that. And we are seeing some places where the church is doing this. The local church leaders are saying, we're going to do 2 people interviews. And we're getting a little pushback in a couple of those places. The kid's like, I'm not sure I want more than one person in the room. But the problem is the bishop needs to be protected. And so if it's someone of the child's choosing and the child says, I'm not sure about this, then maybe it's the counselor, the second counselor or something like that, So there are going to be times when it can be helpful for a youth to be able to talk to a bishop about important things like this. I think that should be sought by the youth. And then the bishop can say, hey, we've got a policy here that we need to have more than one person in the room. Who would you like that to be? And that person gets trained. That's my response on how that is. And it's not okay to just say one person in the room, and because there's not a lot of accountability. We don't know if there's bad questions get asked and the person feels uncomfortable. How's the child going to say, I'm not feeling comfortable with this, bishop? They can turn to the other person and say, I'm not feeling comfortable with this.
I love it. Okay. Well, I think this will sort of represent the end of the first part of this interview, which again was about ways that LDS Church teachings and policies sometimes can hurt both children and victims of abuse. I've really appreciated this first segment. I want to thank everyone who's tuned in so far, and I just want to encourage everyone to stay tuned for part 2 and part 3. Part 2 is going to be about ways that the church needs to improve from your perspective on how it approaches abuse. And then the third part will be how, what members can do to protect their children.